Hello and welcome. I'm Gaurav, and happy to have you joining us for the next in our adaptive leadership series. Today, we're going to be talking about, looking ahead to 2026, right? What are the challenges that we see? What are the opportunities that we see in the environment? And I'm going to be joined today by my colleagues, Nick Petschek, who leads up our EMEA business, and Vanessa Akhtar, who leads up our consulting practice. Really happy to have you both. So thank you for joining today.
Excited to be here. Thanks, Gaurav.
Wonderful. So in terms of the format for today, we're going to do a few different things. So one is we really want to hear from the audience. So we're going to do a couple of polls to understand what you're all seeing as challenges, where you're seeing challenges within your organizations. Excited to have Nick and Vanessa on because they sort of talk to a lot of leaders, a lot of executives, have a lot of perspective around what people are thinking about. And so we're going to have a little bit of a discussion with them around what they're hearing and seeing, where they're seeing challenges, where they're seeing opportunities. And then really excited, we're going to share a little bit about some of our new research, and particularly how some of that research applies to these challenges that we're going to be talking about. And so we'll share a little bit on the research. We'll also incentive to stick around to the end. We'll also at the end share a couple of slides around that. So as always, please use Q&A. The chat function is disabled, but Q&A is active, so please submit questions as we go along. We will try to get to as many of those as we can. And for those that we don't get to, as we've done in the past, we'll send out some materials after the webinar, so you'll have access to thoughts from that as well. And maybe the last housekeeping thing before we get going, as we've done in the past, we'll be putting some slides up as we have some discussion, but then also taking the slides down so that you're not looking at the slides the whole time and we can actually engage with each other. So don't get alarmed if the slides suddenly disappear for you because that's intentional. So maybe just, before we jump into it, like I said, would love to hear from the audience because the end of the year is just such a good time to reflect a little bit on, what's happened in the past year, but also what we expect going forward. And so what we thought we'd do is start with a poll to just understand, for those of you who are joining us, which challenges you think are most urgent for your organization. And so in a moment, we're going to open up a poll. It's multiple choice. So you can only select one. But the question is, which challenge do you think is most urgent for your organization as you head into 2026? So we'll keep that open for a few seconds so folks can respond. And I do recognize, by the way, you might not think any of those are urgent, but hopefully hopefully at least a couple of them feel relevant. All right. As our results popping up, and I think everybody can see these, but just in case you're on a phone or not so visible, looks like sort of leading the charge here is dealing with change fatigue. That's sort of number one, and then scaling AI, responding to cost pressure seem to be relatively close to each other, followed by prioritizing decision making and bridging talent gaps. So. That's a little bit of what we're seeing, and maybe good point here to get Nick and Vanessa into the conversation just around how does that track with what you're hearing from executives? Maybe Vanessa, I'll go to you first.
Yeah.
What are you seeing and hearing?
Yeah. I mean, I think that lines up very closely with what I'm hearing from executives. And lately, in particular, I've been chatting with a lot of executives in the utility space and healthcare space. And while each of those have unique challenges right now that they're facing, right, utilities load growth is a massive challenge across the industry. There's more M&A activity happening than historically. Right, a lot of conversation around hyperscalers and what does that mean and regulations and all of that. And then in the healthcare space, a lot around access. In the US in particular, a lot of questions around what's going to happen if Medicare or Medicaid changes, either reduces or goes away. What does that mean in terms of our payer mix and access for patients? And in the context of all of those specific industry challenges, definitely seeing AI is top of mind for almost every executive of what does that look like for our business? How do we get people using it? We already feel behind in most cases. And then that element of fatigue, I think, especially this time of year, it's even higher than usual. But it's really been a theme, I think, the last 6 to 12 months of people are tired and like, when do we get to give them a breath? Right. And they don't love my answer when I say we are in a world where they're probably not going to get a breath. Right. Some of this is, I think, actually helping them think about how do I navigate a world where I don't get to hit pause for a bit and we don't get to say, oh, we don't have a big change or we don't have a big thing right now. And so I think a lot of executives are hyper aware of that in the conversations that I've been having.
Yeah.
Vanessa, it's great to hear that because it means the folks that I'm talking to are not alone as well. So change fatigue and fatigue generally is probably the top
Mm.
um maybe not complaint, but theme that I'm hearing right now. It also might be I'm doing a lot of end of year events with clients and organizations, right? So your last broadcast or internal communication is
Mhm.
always around reflection and knowing that people are probably overwhelmed and looking forward to a break with their families. Um, at the same time, no one is saying, and come January 5th or whenever you're back online, we'll have a couple of months of, relaxation and steady planning to be able to start the year as we did 5, 10 years ago. So there is this understanding that we are in a new normal of constant change. And how do you then lower the anxiety in an organization, even if the change is not going to slow down? And I think we'll Gaurav talk about that later on in the webinar. So that's one that I'm definitely seeing.
Mhm.
AI also, everyone feels behind that I'm talking to in luxury, manufacturing, pharma, major infrastructure projects as well, right? Where a lot of the cost can be taken out of a project if you're able to get ahead in those spaces. Pharma also is a big place where you can bring costs down. Um, One that I'm not hearing though, which I'm happy about, is kind of leadership misalignment or not sure what next year looks like. So while there's uncertainty in the broader macroeconomic environment and the market itself, I am actually experiencing a lot of organizations saying, and we know where we're going. They may not know how to get there or how to reduce the survive and the anxiety in the organization, but there's at least more that I'm seeing of a clear sense of their purpose and what they stand for in
Yeah.
the in their industry, which to me is really positive because that's what gives you the sustainable energy to kind of push through, right? Especially as we think about maybe 1, 2, depending on what country you're in, 3 weeks of time off to be able to come back and know why we're doing what we're doing is really critical.
Yeah. And I think that's an interesting point, Nick, because I think if I reflect on it, it is similar in a lot of conversations I'm having with executives. And when you go a few layers down, it hasn't permeated yet. Or they're saying this, but that's never been true in the past. So do they really mean it? So I think there is a challenge for leaders going into 2026 of if we're saying something new, if we are clear that we are living in a new time, which means we need to work in new ways, they really need to make sure they're role modeling it in 2026, making sure that they're really clear in the communications about what they know, what they don't know, what the guardrails are, so that it does get to the lower levels where people feel like they have some sense of clarity. I think we've talked about this a lot, Gaurav, right? Clarity, not certainty. Um, but making sure that that leadership alignment doesn't only stay at the leadership level is something I'm seeing a lot of right now.
Which is particularly, I think, relevant with the level of change fatigue, right? Because
Mhm.
because the clearer folks are on the why, the less it feels like random changes, the less
Mhm.
it leads to fatigue and burnout.
Yeah.
Interestingly, that it's interesting that the poll clearly sort of and I realize we might have a little bit of selection bias with our audience, right? Because it's folks who are thinking a lot about change or thinking a lot about transformation. But personally, I was surprised to see that sort of well above AI and cost pressure. I had sort of expected AI to sort of bubble up to the top because of the level of conversation that's happening around AI and the level of sort of, lack of understanding still around how to really integrate AI effectively. But yeah, I mean, I think, when we're thinking about this webinar from our perspective, we'd expect to see AI. We'd expect to see some of the burnout and change fatigue, and definitely want to talk more about that later on in terms of how we're seeing leaders respond to that. The other thing that I think from both of your comments is fairly clear is that no one's expecting things to be all that different next year, right? In terms of the level of uncertainty, in terms of the pace of change around us. It's not the sort of thing where we go, well, this year was very disruptive because we had a pandemic, but we've now figured out how to deal with that, and we expect things to sort of go back to a bit more of a normal. I think people are expecting this continued level of uncertainty, this continued level of pace of change, and so what that I think implies for organizations is the need to get better at moving faster, the need to get better at adapting, at pivoting. And so I'd be curious, maybe our second poll, be curious to sort of hear from our audience what they think is getting in the way of their organizations being able to move fast, right? What is it that's slowing down your organization right now? So we're going to do the same thing, multi-choice poll. So pick what you think is the thing is most getting in the way of speed in your organization.
I always feel like we should be playing the Jeopardy music while we have polls open.
I will not try to hum it.
The New Year's resolution, though, for one of us. It is, I do, as those are coming in, I have found this very helpful for organizations and groups just to have the 30 seconds of reflection, right? To even prioritize for yourself. So almost regardless of what the group thinks, usually from an individual perspective, Jeopardy music or not, it can be beneficial.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we did have a comment come in on the Q&A. I wish I could select multiple for that question, right? Which I think is indicative of some of the challenges right now.
Yeah, and maybe we should have made this a multiple choice but just in terms of, again, I think that's also indicative of the results here, right? It's fairly spread out, which means it isn't one thing that folks are really seeing as the challenge. It's a mix of a few things, decision making, cultural resistance to change. Interestingly, that sort of question around vision that we were just discussing around lack of clarity on vision, right? That is still a challenge. And then the others are less so. We also didn't have another, so there might be other things people are thinking about, which feel free to please pop those into the Q&A if there is something that you think is more important than what's on this list. Excellent. Well, what we thought we would do with this webinar is take sort of the combination of those two poles, right? What are the challenges that we're seeing? And then what are some of the ways that we can help organizations accelerate? What are some ways that we can help accelerate and tackle some of these challenges? And so, Nick, Vanessa, I'd love to maybe start with the sort of topic of AI more broadly, just because that is one that clearly is top of mind for a lot of folks. And I think what will be interesting is thinking about it from a change perspective, thinking about it from a strategy execution perspective. What makes this moment of AI unique, right? What is it that's so different about accelerating the use of AI than other technologies or other changes that we've sort of experienced in the past? So curious, sort of from what you're hearing about, what you're seeing, what you're doing. Where do you think that sort of unique challenge lies for AI adoption?
Yeah. One of the biggest ones that I'm seeing is if you compare it to a lot of the other sort of digital implementations, there isn't yet an established best practice or solution for it. right? I've worked on a number of like big ERP implementations, right? And it's like you go to SAP or you go to Oracle, you have a place to start. You have pre-built solutions that you can adopt and then tailor. AI right now is such a wide span of what's possible, what tools you can use, what challenges you can use it to solve, right? And I think I heard my husband's in tech, and so he sends me all these articles all the time. And there was one about somebody who built an AI solution, and then he saw a job posting that said they were looking for somebody with 8 years of experience. And he was like, I built that 3 years ago. Like that doesn't, somebody with 8 years of experience doesn't exist, right? And so when you think about how much is unknown, but the promise of what's possible, it's hard sometimes to know where to
Mhm.
start.
Mhm. Yes.
It's interesting. You should circulate all of that information with us. That could be helpful. Um, I also find something similar, and then the pattern that I see leaders fall into at times, which I think is a trap, is going to the typical answers as if there were three big players like an SAP, et cetera, or ERPs that there is a clear rollout, right? So whereas I think in AI, you've got a still undefined marketplace with
Mhm.
things emerging daily or weekly, which is really interesting. But what it means is going quickly to a conversation of do we centralize or decentralize
Mhm.
this capability in the organization, which might be right from an ERP perspective or a digitalization perspective, because great, you've got a digital team. We all kind of know how that works. You've got two options, right? It's either out in the departments in a matrix or it's centralized. Um, so I find people are having those conversations too quickly around AI before having the more strategic or even philosophical questions around what do we really think this is going to do for us? Is it something standalone, or is it actually here to support what we've already decided, that prioritization or that clarity of vision, right? And it's the tool then that helps us get there,
Yeah.
which I think we've seen in a couple of other moments in business history where there's something new and we all get really excited about it and we
Mhm.
focus on the thing as opposed to the why, right? We focus on the way to do it as opposed to why we're doing it.
Yeah.
Uh, I think
Well,
that's really critical. And I think back to the 1990s and the early 2000s, and the question everyone was asking, and I did a lot of work in manufacturing at the time, and in the manufacturing space, the question that everybody asked is, "What's your outsourcing strategy?"
right.
Right? And
Mhm.
it was the implied assumption was that outsourcing should be part of your strategy, and what is yours? And I think we're in a similar space, right, where people go, "What's your AI strategy?" And I think what both of you are talking to is AI as an enabler of a business priority or business objectives, and figuring out sort of how it integrates with and how it fits into existing strategic priorities to accelerate them rather than a thing in itself, right?
Mhm.
And I think the level of sort of excitement around it and the level of energy around it and some of the fear, right? There's the fear of being left behind. If I'm a leader and I haven't figured out how to use AI and my competitors do, and so I think there's this um, it's driving in many ways the wrong questions, right? It's driving the question of what are you doing with AI, right? As opposed to
Mhm.
how is it helping you drive business strategy?
Yeah. And I'm seeing that exact dynamic play out, right? One of my clients, there was a sort of an AI mandate. We expect everybody to be using AI at least once a week, if not every day. Since it was the mandate was use AI, what are people doing with it? They're using Copilot to take meeting notes. Yeah, I'm sure that saves a little bit of time for folks, probably gets people a little bit more comfortable with AI, but it's not really driving any sort of meaningful outcome. It's just now sort of also making people anxious about, oh, I was told I had to use AI and I don't really know how to use it, so I'm just going to click the meeting notes button because that's the one thing I feel like I know how to do. Instead of saying, what are the priorities we have or the business challenges that we haven't been able to crack, and how might AI help us do that differently? It really is now just driving compliance rather than innovation in a lot of places, and it's driving activity over outcomes.
Mhm, mhm. Yes. Yeah, and I think a lot of this is the implication of just how fast it's moving, right? So,
Mhm.
I think I mentioned to one of you, I saw Sam Altman on Jimmy Fallon the other day, and he was talking about how his biggest fear with AI is actually the pace at which making change happen, right? At the pace at which stuff is changing. And I think because of that, a lot of the organizations are still very reactive, as opposed to being
Mhm.
able to have more of a proactive approach to this. And so maybe a good point to uh, before we sort of switch, I was going to say maybe a good point to switch to sort of, so what have you seen people doing well? But maybe before we do that, I did want to, as I promised we'd be putting slides up and down, and one of the slides I wanted to share was just some thinking that we've been doing around what are some of the pitfalls that people are starting to fall into with AI, right? So what are some of the transformation challenges, transformation risks that we're seeing? I'll share that slide, and then maybe we can talk about how you're seeing people address some of that. Um, so this again, some of this is not that dissimilar from other changes as well, and I think that's one of the things to keep in mind is there are some unique aspects for sure around AI in terms of change and transformation, but then some of it is actually not that different. So this question of let's make sure we're clear about how it ties into our strategy, how it enables our strategy, what does the future look like with an AI transformation is I think important. That's the one we've talked quite a bit about already. The sense of building urgency and engagement, particularly when people do have some fear and anxiety, right? The media coverage around AI tends to focus a lot on job replacement and how it's gonna be disruptive to the labor market, which you know it may very well be, but I think the more we focus on that, it clearly creates a lot of fear and anxiety. So our leaders need to figure out how to deal with that, right? How to create actual urgency that's driven by excitement and engagement, not by fear and anxiety. So that's a key part of it, which includes, some of the strategies like adopting or getting early adopters to be part of your rollout strategy, relying on SMEs, that sort of thing. Um, Keeping it from, and Nick, you were starting to talk a little bit about this, right? Keeping it from becoming a siloed, hey, everybody's trying to do something with it, or Vanessa, your example of it's a mandate, and so everyone's doing something, but it's all just activity focused. It's not actually driving towards an outcome. And then I think the one we haven't talked as much about, but I'd love to hear as we get into the discussion a bit more is the behavioral side, right? Because more so than even I think other digital technologies, um, the how we use it is so important because how I use an AI tool and how you use an AI tool is going to be different and is going to lead to potentially different outcomes. And so
Yeah.
there's a whole behavioral component to AI adoption that is, I think, far greater than even say, the adoption of a CRM tool or another technology where once you figure out how to use the technology, you kind of all use it the same way.
Mhm.
Whereas with AI, you're using it differently. And so how you use it is critically important. And so focusing on principles, being holistic about how we approach that.
Mhm.
Um, so maybe with some of that as backdrop, I'd love to hear sort of what you're seeing from a success side, right? How are organizations doing this well?
One thing I'm seeing that has been really music to my ears,
Mhm.
switch metaphors. Someone in the chat has asked a question around shouldn't companies be using change management strategies to introduce AI?
Mhm.
Absolutely yes. And they often are not, right? They're often using, Gaurav, what you were just saying is the technology focused approach, which is let's just
Mhm.
roll this out. And then, Vanessa, maybe we mandate some minimum
Yeah.
usage or some sort of activity metric, right? That gets people doing something. Um, the places where I've seen it go really well is when there's both a kind of a vision or a why behind it, which I've was just working with one company that has really nailed that in terms of time efficiency, not from a headcount reduction or cost savings, but from an
Mhm.
innovation standpoint. So if we can reduce, you know, time in activities now by 20%, that gives us Google's or Intel's famous 20% of innovative or go do a side project that you think is, the future for our organization. And what I think was so powerful about how they did that is they used change management strategies and frameworks and ways of getting at people's behaviors and initial responses to new technologies as the leader, as opposed to leading with the technology. So as opposed to going in and saying, here's a new tool, here's how you can use it, they went in with a story essentially of why we're trying to change, why freeing up time could be helpful for all of you and for the company. And wouldn't it be actually fun, literally using the word fun, to be able to have a couple hours a week to be able to work on something that you haven't been, that's been in the back of your mind for the last 5, 10 years, right? So it's a total different flip from how I think most companies are thinking about the, to your point, headcount reduction strategy. If we can, reduce hours by X%.
Mhm. Yeah. And I think a lot of the themes I'm seeing are similar. I think the maybe explicit thing I would call out is where I'm seeing it done well is when they balance space for experimentation and freedom to try things. So there was an employee panel the other day at one of my clients where somebody was saying, yeah, I started with thinking about what are the things that frustrate me every day and not being able to keep up with prioritizing email in my calendar. So I tried a bunch of different prompts until I found one that worked that will scan my email and calendar and say, this is what you have to start with today. Right. And that was just to try some things that'll help you paired with, are there a couple challenges where it is clear how AI can help? So one of their big ones is that end of month close is still hyper manual, takes multiple days of a lot of people, which means the finance and accounting team are basically unavailable the last week of every
Right.
month. How can we use AI to truncate that to a couple hours? And then those folks are actually still available to do all the other things that are part of their job for the entirety of the month.
Yeah, maybe just to build on that one, Vanessa. I mean, I think this idea of it's a dual approach, right? There is
Mhm.
we've got to experiment, we've got to figure out what are some of these ways that we can start to utilize it. And I think then there is okay, and then what is the deliberate, this is how it enables our broader strategy. And for that piece, what at least I'm hearing sort of folks do, which I think works quite well, is to think about what are some criteria around which you can decide where AI is likely to be most effective, right? Whether that is, hey, there's a lot of manual data and input involved, or whether that's there's lots of information to sift through in terms of making decisions. There's got to be some criteria that you outline for your organization that says, okay, that's how we're going to decide what are the areas where we think we can really sort of start to see benefits. And tied to, I think, Nick, the point you were making, which is what's the value we're trying to generate from AI, right? Because if the only value we're trying to generate is cost improvement through efficiency, and that might be fine, by the way, for some organizations, that might be the place to focus. But if it isn't, if there are other things, then we've got to be able to articulate what that value is, whether it's more innovation, whether it's more effectiveness in how we approach certain markets, whether it's acceleration of particular parts of our strategy, right? We've got to be able to identify the value, then use the criteria to determine where we're gonna deliberately try to integrate AI tools. And then I think, Vanessa, your point around you still need the experimentation because it's still so new. We still don't actually know what the best use cases are. And so some experimentation as well, which, again, the sort of the idea of the dual operating system and a networked approach and a hierarchy approach, I think really does play well to this sense of how you go about maximizing the value from AI.
Mhm.
One thing going back to your question, going around maybe old ERP system implementation or digital implementations that I think actually AI implementations or yeah, implementations can learn from is this idea of whether it's super users or change networks, right? That what I'm seeing more is blanket AI across the business as opposed to saying, who, to your point, who might benefit most or who might be able to have highest uptake easiest, right? In your organization, how can you have a opt-in for the first 6 months to figure out where actually those pain points could be most alleviated? And then you've got a group of people who are those super users that can go out and teach their peers, right?
Mhm.
So as opposed to a top-down mandate, you're actually looking back to what has worked in digital transformations in the past and saying, it's the social networks and influence. It's the people that just get tech somehow, even despite their job. Um, their job title, and tapping into that creativity and interest in cutting edge technology is, I think, one of the most untapped potentials in organizations, because there are people that have been curious about this for years, if not more, in your organization, and you might not know it.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that volunteer act, I just saw a question. Oh, it's around sort of the nonprofits. And Janice, nice to see you on. Glad you're on. This question around is it different for nonprofits because they're very concerned about the amount of time that it takes to experiment. And I think, Nick, your point around the volunteer activity, the want to right, I think that's the answer really, because you don't want to force the experimentation. I think you want to leave it up to sort of where people are willing to put some additional energy, that extra capacity that we all have for the things that we're excited about, right?
Mhm. Yeah. And then other people will start to learn from those folks, right? Like if I go back to that panel last week, the number of people that went up to the person on the panel who shared this example is like, can you share those prompts with me? So for those folks, they benefit from that experimentation of the person who's passionate and excited without all the time of testing a bunch of prompts, right? There's already one that their colleague figured out because it was important to them, and then they could benefit from that.
One of because this ties to sort of the next topic I wanted to spend some time on, which is this idea of change fatigue and how do you help to reduce some of what have you seeing around how organizations are helping or leaders are helping reduce some of the anxiety that's being caused by artificial intelligence?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I go back to and I really ground it in the research we've been doing the last few years around sort of the idea of a survive or thrive response. And I think first, the leaders that are most effective are the ones who really understand what might be triggering survive, what might be causing anxiety or fear for their people, where might those challenges be coming from, paired with really being able then to articulate what the upside opportunity is to create more of that thrive, the excitement, passion, opportunity with it, and being able to hold both. Because I think on the flip side, where it's not going well, is employees who are like, my leader just doesn't get it. Right? They're talking about all this exciting stuff, but they don't understand that is my job going away? This is a skill I've never had to use before. Right? So I think if they're not acknowledging what is triggering the anxiety and they just jump to the exciting thing, employees don't feel seen or understood. And so then it's much harder for them to really get on board at any point. Whereas the leaders who can hold both simultaneously are the ones that I'm seeing be most effective.
Yeah. So
I,
maybe,
I it just
go ahead.
I really like that, Vanessa, because the other piece that raises for me too is the authenticity
Mhm.
of that leadership role,
Yeah.
because not every leader is going to understand exactly how the tech works or all of the whys behind it,
Yeah.
and actually being able to open those conversations up with your team to find the places where people do know those answers, and giving them a spotlight, more leadership from more people, as we would say, can be really powerful. The why around cost cuttings is a bit more difficult, obviously, but um, yeah, I see leaders struggling to have all of the answers around a new tool that they know very little about. And I don't think that actually isn't their role, right? It doesn't need to be your role. You don't need to have all the answers. You just need to be able to provide the forum and the comfort, and reduce the anxiety that this can be for our mutual benefit
Mhm.
if we all kind of pull our capabilities together.
So I do want to pause us there on the AI discussion and move to sort of the second, or actually the first from the polls, right? Which was this idea of change fatigue. But maybe before we do that, just I think some of what I'm hearing from the both of you around sort of where you're seeing leaders be successful. Just to summarize, I think one is this idea of being really clear around why, right? And why both why from a value to the business perspective, as opposed to why from a adoption perspective, right? So we're not doing it because we want to adopt AI. We're doing it because we want to drive some significant business value out of what we do with it. I think the second one is this point around creating the space for experimentation because it is still a new technology. It is still something that we don't really know exactly how we want to use. So creating the space for the experimentation, but pairing that with a deliberate strategy that includes an understanding of how the criteria for decision making around where we want to apply the tool, or how we're going to decide which parts of the business are going to benefit from AI. And so sort of pairing those two things, experimentation and deliberation. The sort of behavioral piece, not that different from other changes, right? So using peers, using early adopters, tapping into into sort of the discretionary volunteer energy, because people do have passion around AI, and so sort of employing some of the change tools that we know have worked in other sorts of changes. So ensuring that we're doing that. And then finally, which ties maybe to the value question, is the point, Vanessa, you were making just around from an anxiety perspective, being really clear around the messaging from a survive, thrive perspective, right? So how do we help people move a little bit more towards thrive by being more articulate around the opportunities that AI opens up for the business and for teams and individuals.
Mhm.
Anything you would add to that list?
I think you
I don't know
did.
that it's fully comprehensive, but it at least covers my thoughts right now. Yeah.
All right. Well, maybe let's move a little bit then. Let's talk a bit about the sort of change fatigue, and maybe more broadly, even just the question of sort of burnout. And there's been a lot around the silent cracking, if I'm using that right. So again, what are you seeing? What are you hearing? How are leaders thinking about this, approaching this? How do we help organizations sort of not succumb to the fatigue that people are feeling?
Mhm. Yeah, and this may connect also to one of the questions we got in the Q&A around sort of the connection between the survive and thrive concept and change management. And it came from somebody who's in the federal space. So people are not thriving right now, right? And I think a lot of that is probably this sense of change fatigue paired with uncertainty, paired with, like my phone's on do not disturb right now. I bet when I turn that off, there will be a bunch of notifications about various things that are happening across the federal space and other spaces, right? And so I think one of the things with change fatigue, and when we think about, so kind of, I guess, a 30-second overview of survive and thrive, right? Survive is really our brains looking for a challenge or a crisis that we need to solve. And when it works well, right, it serves a purpose. When it works well, we're able to solve the problem in front of us. When it gets overheated, either because we can't solve the problem or there are too many challenges coming at us or a whole host of things, um, it makes it really hard for us to take action. Whereas Thrive is really looking at opportunity and possibility and allowing us to kind of think bigger. Um, and so I think when it comes to change fatigue, the first piece is really acknowledging where people are. And so if you think about kind of traditional change management tools, it's like, how do you really assess what people value, what's changing for them, what might be getting in the way, right? All of those kind of traditional change management approaches help you understand what might be triggering survive for people. And then I do think there are a couple of elements around being really clear and transparent about what is known, what is not known. Um, Being willing to make trade-offs. So while change is not going to slow down, we also need to stop doing some stuff and take some things off people's plates that probably isn't serving that future vision. And so being willing to do that. And then I think for leaders, continually coming back to the why. Right? So as clear as you can get on the why, even if there's not clarity on the how, using that as grounding for people. And a why that people care about, not a why that only executives care about.
Mm. I ran an exercise just to provide a tactical example, kind of from a workshop perspective that might be helpful that builds Vanessa on the kind of theory or the strategies that you're talking about.
Mhm.
We did a 1 hour session with an exec team a couple weeks ago around signals and noise. So it was a what are you hearing in the organization, right? Just the virtual halls, the real halls, what are the stories that are coming out or the ideas that are coming out? Everything from so and so's leaving to, we're not doing well to we're doing spectacular, right? So, everything was on the table. And then they've tried to figure out, we had defined signal and noise. And then you start to say, okay, which of these would be in which category? And of the noise, which we would usually say is what creates more survive, right? Especially if it's unfounded. How can you then specifically say, here's the bits of information that we know are facts or signal are true that might put us in survive, and we actually want to dial that up because it's important for us to focus on and deal with. And here's the places that's creating anxiety and survive in the organization that are unfounded and are kind of the rumor mill just spinning. And even just giving them an hour to create their own sense of what they're seeing and experiencing, every one of them said, I'm going to go do this with my team next week
Mhm.
because it's in the sense making, it's in the uncertainty and figuring it out together that actually is where I think the thrive starts to come up because you start to see where you have agency and where you can actually make a change in a direction. And I don't think that's just at the leadership level. I think that actually goes down throughout the organization. If you feel like you can control your narrative and focus on what you can meaningfully make an impact on, all of the behavioral research will say that's where you should start.
If I zoom out for a second to sort of this change fatigue question, I think a lot of this, there's obviously a lot of what you're describing are ways to help reduce some of the anxiety, right? Having some agency, having some sort of ability to understand the purpose connected to the work that's happening. And I think part of the challenge is that the amount of change is just so much greater than it used to be. And the method and the idea of hey, we get better and we get better and we get better and we get better at leading change and we get, even better at leading change and we're able to keep up sort of it's just sort of falling apart, right? Because at some point, if you're having to the point that you both made earlier, it's not like you can say, well, I'm not going to change anymore. So if you're having to constantly change, um, even with the most effective approaches to leading change and some of what you're describing, I think you sort of get to the point where it becomes really difficult for organizations to do this effectively. And so, which sort of speaks to our new research, which is all around the idea then of, so if that's the case, what's the answer? And the answer is to create organizations that are inherently better at pivoting and changing so that, you're making these on the grander scale of things, micro adjustments. They may not feel like micro, they might feel relatively large for a team, right? But you're making these constant micro adjustments and you're more adaptable as an organization so that you're not having to launch a large scale change effort on, a reorganization or a new implementation of technology because you're sort of doing it in a more continuous fashion. And so I wanted to maybe use this as a moment to sort of pivot us a little bit to some of that research and how you're seeing that applied to these challenges, right? And so I'll maybe just quickly share a slide to summarize some of where our thinking is going around creating this greater adaptability. And it's sort of these three pillars, right? Uh, you've got to have management approaches that are more friendly to change, management approaches that are more agile. So when I say management approaches, I'm thinking of, things like strategic planning, right? We don't want strategic plans that we set in stone and then execute against, right? We want to be able to be more agile with those. We want to make sure we're using things like scenario planning. We're finding ways to adjust those plans as we go. But also other management approaches, right? Talent management, how we approach much of that, I think, needs to shift. So there's this whole idea around how do we change management practices to be more adaptable. Culture is clearly a huge part of being adaptable and experimentation and people feeling like they can. And some of what you were describing, Nick, in terms of being able to connect themselves to where the organization's going. And so there's a sort of cultural component to it. And then I think, the one that sometimes gets overlooked is actually the capabilities, right? Because we're talking about a new skill set that not everybody has, and a new set of capabilities that we need to actively cultivate in organizations. And so what I thought might be useful is, given sort of this challenge of AI, this broader idea of change fatigue, maybe talk a little bit about how you're starting to see your clients, or how you're starting to see, it doesn't have to be clients, but organizations use either more friendly management practices, culture, or capabilities to help create this more continuous change and help reduce the level of anxiety in organizations.
You want to
I
kick
can
us
jump in
off?
with one, yeah, with one thing I've seen recently on management approaches, and I think Gaurav, you had actually mentioned the word before around principles. So as opposed to starting with here's the edict for what our AI approach is, here's a set of principles that work at the group level. And then every department or every region gets to figure out what that means for them or how they can put that into practice, which creates the agency and actually helps them tailor it to what's most helpful for them. That's been a big piece that I've seen work. I'm actually seeing a question from I'll go as far as to say a friend of mine from an organization we're working with right now, asking around, okay, we can intellectually agree that this is important, but then the day work gets in the way. How do we prioritize that? To me, that gets a little bit to the cultural, the adaptable culture bit, right? Of being able to say, how do we really prioritize and deprioritize different activities? So a lot of organizations are good at prioritizing, but not good at deprioritizing. That's a key. I think we would look at that from probably a systems perspective as well as from a cultural perspective, being able to be comfortable saying no to your boss. So we do a lot of 90-day sprints, results accelerators, and in your 30, 60, 90-day check-in that the cross-functional kind of lower org team has with executive sponsors, one of the things in those organizations that we really emphasize is don't just tell me what you're doing, tell me what you're specifically not doing and are not going to do in the next 90 days. And leader, executive sponsor, it's your job to give me the cover to be able to say no to these things because some of them are requests from outside of my department or higher up in the organization. So if we're serious that this is the focus, then I need to be able to put things off of my plate because even with AI, there's still only 24 hours in a day.
Mhm.
I love that example, Nick, because I think one of the things that we're certainly learning more and more about is how integrated those three pillars are, right? So when you talk about an adaptive culture and this idea of, people being able to say no to things and people being able to deprioritize, and we can't do that without a system that allows it, right? You can't do that without something like hey, look, in every check-in now, not only are you going to ask about what you're doing, you're going to ask about what you're going to stop doing, because that's how you start to send the messages. That's how you start to actually have a shift in culture. And so I think being able to think about these things as integrated across practices, culture, and skills is critical to being successful with it.
Mhm. Yeah, and I might just add, we do a lot of those sort of 90-day sprints in my client settings as well, and have found that pairing that also with some formal training around change and adaptability, like what are the skills that you need? What does this really mean? Right, so that people have the knowledge base to start from when they go into those sort of more experiential opportunities to apply these skills. Finding more and more how important it is to have that as a jumping off point. The impact of those on the job opportunities happens a lot faster. I'm finding when there is some formal capability building and training built into the process, particularly when we think about folks who haven't had the opportunity to maybe be in a high potential program or go through a leadership development program where they've had that exposure. So giving them that baseline has been, I think, a helpful add.
I'm looking. We've got about 10 minutes left, so I do want to try to get to some of the questions that we've got, and also, folks, if you've got other questions, please feel free to keep putting them in the Q&A. I suspect we won't get through all of them, also because some are relatively specific that we're happy to answer offline. So feel free to sort of send us questions in the Q&A right now, and know that we will get back to folks with answers if we don't get to them right now. I think one of the things that sort of come up as I'm looking through these a couple of times, is sort of, and Nick, you touched briefly on it, but how do you start to bridge between people intellectually understanding what needs to happen, and it doesn't even need what needs to happen, even intellectually understanding the vision or the direction of the organization, or understanding, if we think about cost improvements and potential sort of layoffs and that sort of thing, understanding it at a head level, to actually being supportive and committed to it at a heart level, right? So what are some tactics that you've seen people employ to do that, to connect sort of the head and the heart in that messaging?
Maybe, and I'll just give a quick kind of theoretical answer first, and then Vanessa, if you have anything else, um, give me time to think. So one of the things that John came up with a long time ago, which I think is even more relevant now in a hyper information world, is see feel change is the way to go from here to action, as opposed to think analyze change. So you can really easily get stuck in the intellectual arguments of either why you're so right, or why other people are so wrong, or why we need to plan this out 2 years in advance. And that paralysis that sometimes comes from over engineering the intellectual component of it
Mhm.
really gets in our way, because if we see how fast kind of the tools in the AI landscape is changing, there's no way that more than a 6 month plan is really going to be helpful, right? If you aren't building in meaningful learning moments and meaningful places to pivot. So for us, it's the don't think and plan the same way you used to do. Even if you're better than waterfall, you still have to be even better than agile now,
Yeah.
right? So it's the seeing and the feeling that actually drives the action.
Yeah. And I think one of my favorite examples of this that our client did, really in thinking about how do you pair head and heart, because you do need a rational reason for the change. It's not just because you feel like it, right? Like there should be something driving it. You might not have perfect data, but we were working with a health tech company, and really their folks saw themselves as data people and weren't really necessarily connected with the impact it had for patients because it felt so far down the line, right? They found waste in the insurance system and found waste in Medicare and Medicaid, but people didn't connect with that endpoint. And so one of the things that they did was they made this video that still, I think I've watched it 15 times and I tear up every time, of three of their colleagues who have children who are served by Medicare and who get services that they wouldn't get otherwise through traditional insurance, and bringing to life, right? Our ability to find this waste and put it back into the system has allowed, my child with autism to be able to live on his own. And as his parent, I can like, I can sleep at night because I'm less worried about him. Like, though, connecting that data to the real human story, it's like, how can you not then feel some sense of heart and urgency and passion around helping make that a reality and continuing to make that mission true? On the flip side, if you're just like, ooh, I'm on a spreadsheet all day and I can see the number I saved, but it doesn't mean anything to me, and you get tired and burnt out, it's really easy to just be like, you know what, I'm going to take my foot off the gas.
Yeah. One of the other questions I see, and I'm extrapolating a little bit, so for whoever asked the question, apologize. I'm not asking, I'm not answering it directly, but there's this question around time, essentially, right? So if we talk about we need new skills, we need new capabilities, we need to cultivate these skills amongst the organization, and it may not be that people are resistant to the new skills. They might be, willing to learn and willing to sort of change. But do they have the skill? Do they have the time to learn those new skills? Do they have the time to build that capability?
Mhm.
And so maybe just how have you seen people approach that, or any thoughts on how to create that space for the learning that needs to happen?
I, I'll start maybe, Nick. I
Yeah.
feel like
Yeah,
first
go for it.
coming back to typically when you think something's a priority, you're going to find some time for it, right? And so what you invest time and money in as an organization in terms of training or on the job opportunities, right? So I think that's point number one. Do you really think it's a priority? If you don't, you'll find excuses for not putting in the time. Um, Two, then I think it's what are you going to take off people's plates if they need extra capacity, if time really is a legitimate challenge? What are you going to take off people's plates? And then I think providing that formal training is a starting point, but then it's really how do you embed it in the course of normal work, right? And so there's an upfront investment of time, but then I think it is creating the space and opportunities to work differently to put those skills into practice. It's not necessarily about net new activity to build that muscle, right? It's how do you build it into the normal course of work, reinforce it when you see people doing it well, give permission and space and a safety net if people aren't perfect at it, because they won't be at the outset, right? So I think that's maybe where I would start thinking about creating that a little bit more breathing room for it.
I might only add emphasis to two things that you said, Vanessa. One is reinforcement. I think that's a key component of it. So whether you think in terms of 70-20-10 from a learning perspective, making sure you've got time to reinforce and space to reinforce what you're learning, either formally or on the job with peers or mentors or in some sort of guidance or coaching capacity, especially if it can be peer coaching. I think that can be really powerful. Um, and then the bit you said around perfection, no one gets it right the first time, or no one gets it 100% right the first time. And for any of us that have tried to generate an image with any AI tools in the last couple of months, knows you get it almost right the first time and then make the mistake of trying to get it perfect, and then you go, you lose a half a day, right? And it's worse at the end than it was at the beginning. So there is something around being okay with imperfection. I think we have this idea sometimes falsely that AI is going to be perfect, right? Because it's artificial intelligence. It should theoretically be smarter than us, right? And I think if we can get out of that mindset and saying it's just a tool to help us do stuff better and faster for right now, you can add in the human imperfections and be okay with it.
So to bring us maybe we've only got a couple of minutes left. I mean, I think the one main theme I want folks to take away from today's discussion is that, and I think I said this to one of you yesterday, but I read there's a great Adam Grant quote that basically says, look, the answer isn't to get better at thinking, it's to get better at or to get faster at rethinking. And I think that's true of transformations, right?
Mhm.
And of change in general. We've got to the point, I think, with the pace of change around us that we've got to we've got to start to not try to solve the problem of change fatigue or the problem of not being quite certain how to drive AI adoption by being more deliberate, right? The answer isn't get more deliberate, get more careful, get more planned around how we implement change. The answer is get better at making pivots, get better at dealing with the emergent opportunities, get better at dealing with the emergent challenges, and being able to pivot, which means skills, which means culture, which means new management practices, right? So going back to those three pillars, if we can start to create those sorts of systems, structures, practices that are more willing to change or that are more flexible, if we can start to create cultures that are more accepting of change and are more encouraging of experimentation, and then the capabilities and skills that allow people to actually do that, that's how we start to deal with this greater environment of change and uncertainty. So. Maybe on that note, Nick, Vanessa, anything you'd wanna add before we wrap up here?
You shared that with me, probably also with
Yeah,
Vanessa, and
yeah,
I loved it for a variety of reasons. One is it gets you to action and it gets you into something that may not be perfect, but you get to reassess it and you get to rethink it. And I think that's where I see a lot of creativity in teams and individuals coming from, is being comfortable not being perfect, and getting into the work, right? Let's maybe stop theorizing about it and start implementing.
yeah. And maybe the only other thing I would add is a challenge for everybody on the call. I shared this with a client recently at the end of a leadership session. We've talked a lot about change fatigue. It's a time of year where personal batteries get really low. It's also a unique moment where a lot of folks have the opportunity to actually take some time away from their desk because so many people are out. And so really also thinking about how can you use the next few weeks to refill your own battery so that you can be a role model of what it looks like to implement some of these ideas at the start of the new year. And so maybe just a personal challenge for folks to really take the next couple of weeks to say, what am I going to do to fill my battery so I can be a leader in this space and in this way when we come back.
Super. Well, with that, just want to say thank you first to Nick and Vanessa for joining today, and thank you all for joining us in the discussion. I think there were I saw a couple of things in the chat around things people wanted to follow up with. We will definitely follow up with folks around those questions, and also send out just a little bit of thinking material around some of the topics that we've discussed. So. Thanks everybody for joining us. Have a great end of the year, and a wonderful start to 2026.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care, everyone.